chosen ones. These 4 tests are mandatory in the last days if you want God to truly use you. You didn't click this by accident. You've been walking through hell, but no one saw it. Not even the ones you prayed with. You didn't scream. You didn't run. You didn't cheat, and heaven noticed. God gave you an exam with no instructions, faith with no answer key, time with no timeline, righteousness that got you rejected, and a wilderness where even your own voice went quiet. And you didn't quit. You passed. Type 777 if your soul just said, "Finally, someone sees me." The season of the exam. You never signed up for. You didn't ask for this. You didn't sign your name on some divine clipboard that said, "Yes, I'll carry what breaks others." But here you are, trembling, tired, still standing. They call it a test of faith, like it's something poetic. But you've lived the kind of silence that makes even worship feel like a lie. You've waited not for days, but for divine silence to mean something. And maybe you've asked yourself in the dark, is God watching me? Or did he forget I exist? Let me tell you something most won't say out loud. Being chosen is painful. It means being handed an exam you didn't prepare for, with no study guide, no cheering crowd, and sometimes no evidence that God is even grading. But, oh, he is. Every act of obedience you did, while no one clapped. Every moment you stayed kind, stayed silent, stayed faithful. When bitterness would have made more sense, heaven recorded it. You didn't just endure the test, you passed it with honor. If you're watching this, it's not by accident. This is confirmation you were examined in silence, graded in private, and now heaven is about to publish your results. You passed the test no one saw. That means God can finally trust you with what's next. Part 1. Faith in the Fog Hospital Waiting Room. An old Bible clutched in one hand, bills in the other. Faith is easy when things work out. When the check clears, when the scan is clean, when they love you back. But what about when nothing does? What about the seasons where even your prayers sound like they're hitting the ceiling and falling back into your lap? That's not faith in the light. That's faith in the fog. And that's the exam you didn't know you were already taking. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. But let's be honest. What do you do when there is no evidence? When all you see is contradiction? When what God promised doesn't match what's in your hands? Do you still trust him? You didn't know it, but that was your exam paper. Your tears were ink. Your silence was submission. Your obedience, while confused, was your passing grade. God didn't need you to be strong. He needed you to trust. If this were you, still praying even when your voice cracked, would you believe that God was grading that moment as gold? This is where most walk away. They say, if God was real, he would have answered by now. But you stayed, not because it made sense, but because something deeper than understanding held you. That's what God was waiting to see. Would you worship with empty hands? Would you believe without proof? That's not weak faith. That's warrior faith. He didn't just believe in what God said. He believed in who God was, and that's exactly what you've done. You may not feel faithful, but you stayed even when staying looked like losing. You walked through fog with no flashlight, just the memory of God's voice. And heaven whispered, that one is mine. If your entire season was just a test, and you already passed it, would you still be doubting your worth? Part 2. Time. The long silence. A worn calendar. Years crossed out. A voicemail never returned. A woman sits alone in her car, engine off, just waiting. They told you God's timing was perfect, but they didn't tell you how long it would feel. They didn't tell you about the empty chairs, the birthdays missed, the inbox full of maybe next time. The prayer journal that now just feels like a dream graveyard. Waiting on God is the kind of pain that doesn't bleed, but it bruises the soul. You've said, "I trust you," but inside, you've whispered, "Are you still there?" Because nothing's moving, nothing's shifting. Everyone else seems to be sprinting, and you're just still. What if the waiting wasn't punishment, but positioning? That's where you are, buried, but not forgotten. See, a seed doesn't grow in the light. It prepares in the dark. Roots dig deep before any bloom breaks the surface. That's what time does. It doesn't delay your destiny. It digs your roots. You're not late, you're just underground. For now, God promised. And then he paused. But the pause wasn't a denial. It was a setup. Because when Isaac came, it wasn't late. It was exact. If God answered you too early, would you have had the strength to carry it? Would the blessing have crushed the unready version of you? He heard that. And the clock in heaven didn't stop. It was syncing everything. That connection, that opportunity, that restoration. It's not coming. It's just not coming until you're ready. You're not stuck. You're becoming. And when the door opens, you won't just walk in, you'll fit. What if the wait was the training and the silence was sacred? Part 3, Rejection for Righteousness. A dinner table with an empty chair, a silent phone, social media seen but never replied to. Rejection hurts, but rejection for being righteous, that breaks something deeper. Not because you were arrogant, not because you were loud, but because you wouldn't laugh at their darkness. You wouldn't water down your light. And suddenly, you were too much. They used to say you're different. Now they say nothing at all. You didn't change. You just grew, and they got uncomfortable. What if their distance wasn't rejection, but redirection? What if God used their silence to answer your prayer, to be used for greater things? He didn't do anything wrong, and still they chose Barabbas. Rejection is not always about what you did. Sometimes it's about what they can't face. You became a mirror. Your peace exposed their chaos. Your purity threatened their compromise. Your no to gossip felt like judgment, even when you said it in love. So they labeled you weird, religious, too deep, and God allowed it. Lord, why did they walk away? And somewhere in that sacred silence, heaven replies, because I'm calling you up, and they weren't meant to come. Jesus said, if the world hates you, remember, it hated me first. So when they ghosted, you mocked your obedience, laughed at your boundaries. You were passing a test, not failing a friendship. If everyone liked you, would your light be too dim? You didn't lose friends, you lost weights. And now you're lighter, so you can fly. God saw your silence when they mocked you. He's building a table, and guess who's about to watch you eat? Part 4, the wilderness dry hills. No Wi-Fi, no replies. A journal with no fresh words. You walking? Nowhere. The wilderness doesn't feel holy. It feels forgotten. It's not a stage. It's a silence. No crowds, no confirmation, no miracles, just you and questions. You kept thinking, if I pray more, this will break. But it didn't. You fasted and the fog stayed. You tithed and still felt broke. You worshipped, but the heavens stayed silent. And you whispered, God, are you here? What if God didn't speak? Not because he left, but because he was listening. The wilderness isn't proof of absence. It's proof of intimacy. It's where Jesus went before the ministry, not after. And he wasn't led there by Satan. He was led there by the Spirit. You weren't abandoned. You were being stripped of noise, of crutches, of the old version of you that couldn't carry where God was calling you next. That's where leaders are made. Not on stages, but in sandstorms. Because before you walk into promise, you have to die to Egypt. Have you ever felt like the wilderness was killing you, when it was actually birthing you? The silence wasn't punishment. It was precision. Heaven was watching how you responded, when there were no signs, no applause, no updates. And guess what? You kept walking. You didn't curse him. You stayed pure in the drought. That was the test. And you didn't even know you were passing it. Gold isn't made in comfort, it's made in fire, and you, chosen one, were forged in isolation. If this wilderness was never meant to feed you, but to reveal you, would you thank it instead of cursing it? You were never wandering. You were being led by a God who hides just long enough to reveal what's really inside you. Part 5. Heaven's silence was not God's absence. Bedroom 2 a.m. Open Bible unanswered texts. You lie still, but your spirit is loud. You've heard it said, when God is silent, he's still working. But what about when he's silent for so long? You start to wonder if you were ever hearing him in the first place. You asked for a sign, you begged for a word, but all you got was stillness. No confirmation, no prophecy, not even a whisper in the wind. And somewhere deep inside, you wondered, was I wrong? Did I miss it? What if the silence wasn't God ignoring you, but God trusting you? Because silence is never empty when it's from heaven. It's strategic, intentional, sacred. It's the sound of a teacher during the final exam, watching closely not because you're abandoned, but because your answers are being written in real time. Heaven wasn't panicking. Heaven was watching, waiting, letting the earth believe it was over, while resurrection was loading. You think God left because he stopped talking, but you missed this. God trusted your silence more than others' volume. You didn't fill the void with compromise. You didn't force a door open. You didn't fake a prophecy to feel spiritual. You stayed still. And that stillness became sacred obedience. Have you ever realized that your greatest growth didn't come from what God said, but from what he didn't? That's maturity. That's trust. That's the kind of faith heaven brags about. Have you considered my servant? That's what God says about warriors like you. You didn't fake it. You just faithed it. And now that silence is about to break, not because you demanded it, but because you passed the test no one even knew was happening. What if God was never late, just waiting for you to stop needing noise to prove he was near? He didn't leave. He leaned in. And now, the silence is becoming a sound. And that sound is the sound of heaven moving. Part 6. When everyone past you over heaven took notes. Office party you weren't invited to. Empty inbox. That moment at church when your gift went unnoticed again. They chose her. They promoted him. They celebrated everyone else. And you. You smiled anyway, clapped anyway, served anyway, quiet, invisible, but not unseen. They passed you over again, didn't recognize your gift, didn't honor your effort, didn't ask how you were doing, but heaven did. What if the silence from man was the spotlight of God? God never writes with ink. He writes with timing. And every moment they overlooked you, he wrote it down. Every sacrifice, every yes when you were hurting, every uncelebrated seed you sowed in secret. It wasn't for them anyway. It was for the kingdom. God told the prophet, do not consider his appearance. I look at the heart, and your heart. It passed a test even you didn't know you were taking. What if the promotion isn't coming from man because it's not supposed to? What if God is waiting for the moment when it's so obvious? Thus, only he could have done it. That posture. That's kingdom leadership. Heaven doesn't promote talent. Heaven promotes trust. And you've proven you don't need a stage to be faithful. You don't need a platform to be powerful. You don't need recognition to stay righteous. God was taking notes when they didn't tag you. God saw it when they used your idea. God saw it when they walked away after you poured everything in. And now, heaven's about to answer for you, not with revenge, but with reward. If man never claps, would God's hand on you be enough? They passed you by, but God passed you through, and now your name is being mentioned in rooms you haven't even entered yet. You were never overlooked. You were reserved. Part 7. You didn't cheat. You didn't compromise. That's what passed you. Midnight. Everyone else is sleeping. You're still fasting, still praying, still choosing integrity when no one's watching. Everyone had a shortcut. They lied. They used people. They cut corners. They called it strategy. But you stayed honest. You stayed holy. And no one clapped for that. No one posted about that. But heaven recorded it. What if the test wasn't about results, but resistance? See, God's chosen aren't just anointed, they're trusted. And trust doesn't come through what you win. It comes through what you walk away from. You didn't cheat. You didn't bend. You didn't sell your calling for likes, for validation, for momentary gain. And that's what passed you. Daniel could have eaten the king's food. Everyone else did. But he stayed on vegetables, and heaven called it strength. It wasn't about food, it was about faithfulness. It was about a soul that said, even if I'm the only one, I won't bow to compromise. It is written. That's what he answered with, and so did you. You answered temptation with truth. You answered pressure with prayer. And now God can trust you with more because you didn't trade your integrity for influence. Have you ever realized that what disqualified others was the very thing you refused to do? The reason your breakthrough is taking longer is because God's building something that won't collapse. He doesn't rush the trusted ones. You didn't cheat the process, so God won't cheat the promise. If the only reward for your purity was heaven's smile, would that still be enough? You passed the test of integrity. Now, you qualify for authority. Part 8. The transition has begun. Without your permission, same room, same you, but something shifted. Clock hits 4:44. A stranger holds the door open and says, "There's something about you. You didn't feel anything change." But it did. You didn't see a prophetic cloud. But heaven moved, and it didn't need your permission. Because transition doesn't begin outside. It starts within. You thought God forgot you. You thought nothing was shifting. But in the spirit, angels were dispatched. Rooms were rearranged. Your name whispered in spaces you've never entered. What if the shift already started? But you were too humble to call it a breakthrough. The pain didn't announce its exit. The dry season didn't send a goodbye letter. But suddenly, you're not crying over what you used to. You're not explaining your worth to people anymore. That's transition. It doesn't always feel like fireworks. Sometimes it just feels like peace. That's not small talk. That's divine confirmation. The transition is quiet, but undeniable. Doors you didn't knock on are opening. People are apologizing without you demanding it. The weight lifting, and the strangest part, you didn't ask for this. You didn't even feel ready. But heaven said, they're ready now. What if your silence was actually your surrender, and surrender is what triggered the shift? That's how it's coming, not gradually, suddenly. Because those who passed the hidden test get public promotion. You were faithful when no one thanked you. You were consistent when it was boring. You were clean when compromise felt easier. So heaven moved the line forward and placed your name on the next call list. If the door opened today, would you recognize it as the very thing you were being prepared for? You didn't schedule this shift. God did. And now, He's calling you forward. Part 9, Heaven's report card, well done, good and faithful. One dream sequence, a glowing scroll. A golden pen writes your name in silence. Back in reality, a phone call. An open door, a stranger says, "You're the one we've been waiting for." You didn't know it was a test. You thought it was life falling apart. You thought it was delay. You thought it was divine forgetfulness. But it was evaluation. And now the results are in. Your heart skips, not because of pride, but because you almost quit last week. What if the breakthrough was never about arrival, but about your accuracy during the silence. Heaven doesn't measure performance like earth does. You didn't have to be the loudest, the most gifted, the fastest. You just had to be faithful. That's what passed you. Not perfection, not popularity, but your ability to stay when leaving felt easier. That kind of faith, the heaven honors it with glory. Because now you know. Every season was preparing you for this moment. Every no, every tear, every empty table, they were part of the report card, and heaven just returned its stamped approved, anointed, appointed. What if you weren't being tested for the blessing, but for the weight that comes with carrying it? Heaven didn't need a perfect score. It needed a heart that wouldn't fold. And you showed up broken and still believed. You showed up weary and still obeyed. You showed up alone and still walked with God. So now you're being crowned not for winning, but for lasting. Would you still have passed? If no one ever saw you trying, God just handed your name to angels. They're preparing the next room because the faithful are about to be promoted publicly. Part 10. Your crown is waiting where you almost quit back. Where it all began, same room, same window, same silence. But something is lighter. Funny how God brings you back to the place you almost gave up, just so you can see how far you've come. Same hallway, same unanswered prayers, same quiet, but this time you're different. What if the very place you cried in is the place God hid your crown? You didn't see it then, but heaven was folding something behind the curtain. An assignment, a door, a nameplate with your purpose engraved in gold. And now it's being delivered to the last place you prayed. God, I'm done. Inside, not money, not fame, just instructions. It's time. You didn't quit. And because of that, you qualify to wear what others tried to steal. This crown wasn't earned. It was endured. Every tear was a gemstone. Every silent night a carving of trust. And now you wear something invisible that shakes the spiritual realm. He didn't rush out. He shaved. He prepared. Because destiny doesn't need hype. It just needs readiness. What if your crown was hidden in the place you were most humiliated? God doesn't waste breakdowns. He builds thrones out of them. The pain didn't disqualify you. It positioned you. And now you're going to lead with scars, but also with oil. What if what you survived is now what qualifies you to speak into others' storms? This is why you were crushed. This is why you were passed over. This is why you didn't die there. Because your crown was waiting exactly where you almost gave up. You passed in private, now heaven will reward you in public. You made it through the exam you didn't study for, the test no one told you was coming, the silence that felt like punishment, but was actually purification. Faith, time, rejection, wilderness. These weren't just seasons, they were assignments. And you passed. Not with applause, not with clarity, but with courage. Well done, my child. You stayed clean when the shortcut looked easier. You stayed kind when bitterness made more sense. You stayed when no one stayed for you. This is not the end. This is the unveiling. Heaven's been waiting for this version of you, the one that's been sifted, scarred, and yet still surrendered. You didn't imagine the battle. You didn't fake the growth. You were refined for this moment because God doesn't promote perfection. He promotes perseverance. You passed in silence. You trusted in drought. You stayed when quitting felt holy. And now heaven is moving in your direction because it knows you're ready. You were tested to be trusted. And now you've been chosen to carry what others fumbled. If this spoke to your spirit, if you've walked through what no one saw and still kept the faith, comment 777 below. Let heaven and earth know I didn't quit, and I know now I was chosen. Share this with someone who's been quiet for too long, someone who needs to know you didn't fail. You were being refined, you passed, and now get ready for what God's about to trust you with next.